Cowboy, we are shivering. Get in my shelter now. Wild West redemption in the Sandstorm. The sun was a searing brand against the cracked earth, and the wind, a cruel and relentless thing, kicked up sand that stung like 1,000 wasps. It had been days, maybe a week, since I'd felt solid ground beneath my feet that wasn't trembling with my own exhaustion. The old weight of my past had settled deep in my bones, a heavy, unshakable burden that had driven me from town to town, always just one step ahead of the memories and the ghosts that haunted my sleep. I was a man with no place to go, only a past to run from, and out here, in this unforgiving wilderness, I thought I'd finally found a place to let the journey end. My name is Rue Thorne. At least, that's what's left of it. The man I used to be, the one who could track a whisper and bring a fugitive to justice with a single, steady hand, he's just a ghost now, wandering the same desolate trail I'm on. I used to be a name that commanded respect, a bounty hunter whose legend was whispered in saloons from the Rio Grande to the Rockies. But all that faded the day I let pride blind me. The mission was simple: bring in a bank robber. But he wasn't alone. A boy, no older than 10, was with him, scared, trembling, clinging to a man who didn't deserve to be clung to. I saw the kid, and still I took the shot. A good bounty hunter gets the job done, no matter the obstacles. That's what they taught me. My bullet sang wide, kissed a rock, and came back wrong. The boy folded like a rag in a high wind. The robber lived, the child did not. Justice didn't ride home with me that day. Only silence did, the kind that finds every crevice in a man and pours in like cold water. The money from that bounty felt like blood money. I gave it all to the boy's people, but silver doesn't rattle the bones of the dead back awake. After that, my hands weren't the same. They shook when they should have been still. My colt felt heavier than a sin I was tired of naming. I sold the gun, then the horse, then the saddle. Pride went next. I kept the boots because bare feet on desert stone felt like a punishment too theatrical, and I'd had enough theater for a lifetime. The land thinned into nothing. Mesquite like the bones of a hand raked the sky. Heat shimmered in the air, turning distance into a fever dream where water looked like a memory and shade felt like a rumor. Somewhere inside that glare, I realized I wasn't walking toward anything anymore. I was walking away. And if a way had a direction, it pointed straight into the Sunday. When the storm came, it didn't ask for permission. The sky, blue as old glass all morning, went jaundiced and mean. The wind rose, first curious, then angry, then holy. It brought sand up from the fossil beds, from every dry arroyo and cracked wash, and hurled it at me as if God had some clumsy apprentice tasked with sandblasting sinners clean. I went to my knees and felt them sink. Grit found my eyes, my teeth, my soul. I pressed a palm to my ribs, where an old war wound still chimed in bad weather and worse luck. Breath turned to work. The storm kept at me like a pair of debt collectors. I figured that was how it ended. A man can die a lot of ways out here: by bullet, by thirst, by another man's hunger, but dying in a sandstorm felt tidy. No witnesses, no jury, just the wind to read the verdict and the dunes to shovel the grave. Then I saw it, a dark seam in the bluff, a rectangle too straight to be God's work. Raw, sun-bleached planks braced a low doorway. Between me and that slit of shadow stood a figure with a blanket around her shoulders, hair whipped into black fire by the gale. She was small, yes, but she was built in lines that didn't break easily. She studied me as if I were a coyote nosing at a camp. There was a first thought on her face: he won't last. His edges are already turning to dust. The second thought pushed through and softened her eyes. If I pull him in, I might be pulling trouble in with him. She came anyway. Her arm slid under my shoulder with the kind of strength you only get from lifting your life one day at a time. "Up," she said, clear above the roar, English shaped carefully as if each word might shatter. "Get in my shelter." I rose like a bad idea and leaned into her. We moved together, her, laboring, me, trying not to be more dead weight than I already was. The doorway swallowed us. Sound shrank. The world retreated to a circle of smoke and orange firelight. I pressed my back to a wall that felt dug, not given earth carved by patient hands and stubborn need. The air tasted like beans and ash. A pot simmered. Lines of washed cloth hung from a taut cord and dripped slow onto packed dirt. It was a home the way a scar is a story. Not pretty, but proof of survival. Shelves had been chiseled smooth enough to cradle jars and a tin. The fire pit was ringed like a fortress, a hole in the roof caging smoke and letting it go by degrees. Tools were few but arranged with a mind that knew the cost of losing things. Everything wore the same expression, use me or leave me be. She crouched by the fire, dipping a rag in steaming water. The blanket slipped from her shoulder and showed the honest truth of her life, a dress patched with raw twine and careful hands, a collarbone like a question mark under skin the color of wet cedar. She pressed the hot cloth to my brow. It stung, which is another word for coming back to yourself. You're bleeding, she said. It'll stop, I answered, or rasped something shaped like that. Talking felt like trying to lift a trunk by its handle, and finding the handle wasn't screwed in tight. She didn't varnish words with pity. Her hands were calloused, steady, and gentler than anything I deserved. When she gave me a bowl, she looked me in the eye the way folks do when they're measuring out their last cups of flour. Eat, then talk. The beans tasted like a promise kept. I ate slow. Not because I wasn't starving, but because starving men look like wolves when they're fed, and wolves get shot. I'd been a lot of things. I didn't have the energy to be a wolf, too. Across the fire, she watched without staring. She had the kind of face sorrow carves with thin knives, no wasted softness, no spare indulgence, yet beauty lived there anyway, the stubborn kind that shows up when a person has already decided not to bother with it. Her hair was a nation all its own, dark and long, tied in a simple knot with fraying hide. Her gaze kept coming back to my hands, as if hands told more reliable stories than mouths. She clocked the tremor, the way I held the bowl low, as if recoil might visit me at dinner. She also clocked the scar along my jaw, the one that makes strangers wonder what I did wrong and friends wonder what I survived. You walked, she said, not a question. Walked, I agreed. From where? From myself, mostly. She accepted that like a person accepts weather not with approval, just recognition. After a while, she added, storms come strong this moon. You picked a poor time to die. Oh, I've been picking poor times most of my life, I said, and found a smile wandering around my face like it had been lost for years, and finally found its way home. It startled us both. She didn't smile back exactly, but something in her eased, the way a rope eases when a horse finally stops pulling. Name? She asked. Rue. Her eyes flickered, not at the name but at what names do. People with names are harder to bury in the sand. Elara, she said after a beat. Elara Vance. The last word carried history. It didn't marry clean with her face, or the lilt in some of her vowels. I filed the question where good questions go near the fire, to keep warm until the right moment. She worked while I warmed, moving in the sure, economical pattern of someone who had counted minutes and beans enough times to know both were a currency you spend carefully. She wiped grit from my cut, tore a strip off a hem that had already sacrificed too much to the cause, and bandaged me like she'd wrapped herself up 100 times and was tired of the shape of wounds. When speech came easier, I gave her the short version. Not the boy's name, I didn't know it, and I wouldn't have told it if I did, but enough of the thunder to explain the lightning. I hunted men, I said. One day my bullet found a child instead of a thief. I left the work. I left the gun. Walking seemed like a thing I could still do without hurting anybody. She listened the way a canyon listens, taking sound in, holding it for later, not echoing it back unless the echo might teach you something. You gave up the gun, she said at last, and the statement felt heavier than a question. I sold it. The money didn't fix anything. No, she agreed, and it wasn't sympathetic. It was true. I wanted to ask why she lived underground like a prairie dog that had traded daylight for safety. I wanted to ask who had given her that last name, and whether she'd chosen it or it had been nailed to her. But a person asks too many questions in a shelter like this, and the shelter closes around them like a mouth. So I sat with the heat and the ache in my ribs and let the bean-thick air settle. Later, when the storm's roar shifted from God voice to mere yelling, she fetched a clay jug from a shelf and wrapped the blanket tight around her waist. Water, she said. You walk. I can walk, I told her, and did. Outside, the world wore the storm's fingerprints. Sand had drifted in graceful, murderous shapes. The rim was a jagged grin against a sky trying to remember how to be blue. We moved down a narrow goat path to a kinked creek, the kind that hides like a smuggler and only shows its goods in small glimpses. A leaf-thin sheen of ice wore the water like jewelry. She broke it with a stone and filled the jug, eyes never resting in one place long enough to be surprised by anything terrible. Halfway back, her foot skidded on slick rock. My hand found her elbow. She steadied fast pride quicker than reflex, and only then let the gratitude flicker across her face like sunlight through smoke. The touch, brief as it was, altered something. Not a vow. Not even a truce, just a recalibration of the distance between two bodies trying to occupy the same piece of mercy. Back in the dugout, she handed me a second bowl without ceremony. When I slid half of it back toward her, she didn't refuse. She also didn't say thanks. Neither did I. The gratitude was in the arithmetic. Night came with the sound of sand slurring along the door and the roof creaking the way ships creak when the sea wants them and the captain doesn't. Ilara set a bar across the plank door and showed me with a nod that this, too, was part of the ritual of staying alive. I lay on a pallet of woven grass beside the fire and learned the timetable of her breath. It stayed shallow, as if sleep were a luxury that had to be paid for in installments. I offered to take first watch. She shook her head once, an economy of refusal. You make the second fire, she said, meaning rest now, feed the coals when they ask for food. It was trust measured out in spoonfuls, and I took it as holy. When the coals whispered for more, I whispered back with split mesquite. The flames rose shy, then confident. In their light, I studying the dugout's two other truths. First truth. There was a shelf cut high, near the vent, large enough for a child to sleep if a child lived here, which one did not. Second truth. Beneath the sleeping shelf, a flat stone that didn't match the others hid a hollow space. Her eyes tracked mine to the stone and away again, the way a person's eyes track the pistol they promise they'll never use. Traitors dug here once, she said at last, answering the question I hadn't spoken. My father showed me the place when the storms were cruel. They left. I stayed. Alone? I asked, because sometimes a question deserves to be given its own name. Alone, she said, and the word didn't weep. It stood up straight on its feet. I rolled the word around my mouth and found it fit too well. I know something about that. She looked at me a long time. In the look lived 1,000 miles of road, 1,000 unasked favors, 1,000 mornings when she had broken ice and counted beans and added nothing but work to the day. At length, soft as dust, she asked, "Why keep walking?" "Because there's a difference between being hunted and hunting yourself," I said. "I've been both. The first ends when your luck runs out. The second ends when your feet do." Her mouth bent into a shape that might have turned into a smile if it had time to ripen. "Your feet still moving," she said. For the moment. Sometime near dawn, the wind quieted enough for the world to remember its shape. I felt the ache in my ribs like a low drum. She moved through the morning tasks with that same clean certainty. Coffee boiled black and honest. She handed me a tin cup and sat opposite, legs under her, blanket wrapped. For a breath, it felt like we were two people and not two kinds of damage sharing a hole in the earth. "You can stay until the storm's done," she said, eyes on the cup. "Not me. After, the desert will not keep you." "Storm's not done," I answered, which was a way of saying I wasn't either. Her gaze climbed to mine, steady as a hand on a bridle. "You know my rule if riders come," she said. "You do not speak. You do not show yourself. Understood? Not for your sake," she added, "for mine." "Understood," I said again, because truth repeated becomes a promise. We spent the day sealing seams with damp clay and brush. I split what passed for wood and told my ribs to quit their complaining. She checked traps with a patience I'm not sure I ever possessed even when I was young enough to pretend I did. When she set a snare, her hands worked the wire like the world was a knot, and she meant to live by tightening it just right. That evening, when the beans gave way to a strip of rabbit roasted on an iron rod, the dugout's smallness felt less like a coffin and more like a chapel. In that light, she looked different to me, not because the fire was kind, but because my eyes were. The scar at her temple read as a line in a map I wanted to learn. The torn seam of her dress read as a ledger where she had balanced losses and still managed to write "paid" at the bottom in a neat hand. "Why did you bring me in?" I asked finally, because sometimes a man wants the miracle explained even if explanation spoils it. She considered the wall the way some people consult a Bible. "Because you were dying outside," she said, "and because I am tired of watching things die." "Thank you," I said, which felt like pouring water on a field I had burned myself. It wasn't enough, but it was the only offering I had. She nodded. "Do not make me regret it." "I'll do my best work in that department," I told her, and she snorted softly, the first sound she'd made that wasn't built to carry weight. Night came back. The wind kept its distance like a dog that's not sure whether to bite or bed down. We lay as before, the fire weaving red on mud and skin. Somewhere between two breaths, I realized I wasn't waiting to die anymore. I was waiting for morning. And morning, stubborn thing that it is, found us. I woke to the scrape of metal on stone and the smell of coffee so strong I forgave it for being thin. I watched her move, cataloging details the way a starving man catalogs the shape of a loaf, the neatness of the shelves, the way she kept her blanket folded just so, the rhythm of her hands when she ground beans into meal, quiet music made with poor instruments. I counted each small grace and filed it under reasons to stay alive. The storm had not forgiven us, but it had forgotten us for an hour. That was enough. We ate without ceremony. She pushed the larger share toward me. I pushed some of it back. This was our language now: give, return, accept. When she lifted her eyes, surprise ghosted across them. It left as quickly as it came, replaced by something that looked a little like respect and a little like resignation. "Rue," she said, as if trying my name on again to see if it still fit. "If the riders come, remember your promise." "I will. And if you break it," she added, not cruel, just exact, "we die." "I won't break it." "Good," she said, and tied her hair back with leather, and the day began. I don't know what other men call salvation. I once thought it was a badge or a sack of coin or the feel of a trigger breaking clean. In a dugout carved out of stubborn earth, salvation looked like a bowl passed across a fire. It sounded like a voice that didn't tremble, even when the body it lived in should have. It felt like work that wore no hero's clothes, sealing a seam, lifting a jug, watching the rim until your neck ached, work that ended with both of us still breathing. The desert hadn't forgiven me. The boy's ghost hadn't either, but the wind eased a little, and Alara didn't ask me to leave yet, and the door's bar held fast. That was enough to call it a beginning. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway, to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The morning light crept through a narrow fissure above the dugout door, a thin, pale spear cutting through the darkness. I woke to the soft scrape of metal on stone and the low murmur of a fire finding its voice again. For a long while I stayed motionless, waiting for the storm's howl to return and finish what it had started. But the silence that came instead was stranger than the roar. Silence in the desert is never empty. It carries its own kind of weight, heavy with watching eyes and unfinished reckonings. Ilara was crouched at the fire, coaxing life into the embers. The blanket had fallen down her shoulders, and I saw the worn fabric of her dress, patched with twine in seams that had split more than once. Her braid had loosened in the night, strands falling across her cheek as she bent to the flames. The smell of coffee rose bitter, rough, but more precious than gold. When she noticed me stirring, she poured into a dented tin cup and slid it toward me. Coffee, strong. My ribs screamed when I sat up, but I forced myself upright and wrapped both hands around the tin. The heat was a brand against my palms. I sipped, grimaced, and swallowed anyway. The taste was acrid, sharp as gunpowder, but it steadied me. "You've been here long?" I asked, though my voice was a cracked thing. She stared into the fire. "Since the first sandstorm. For moons. I do not count days." There was a hardness in the way she said it. Moons meant seasons, not hours. Survival wasn't measured in minutes here. It was measured in how many times you could outlast the sky's punishments. "Why this place?" I pressed. She hesitated, her jaw working. "Because my people do not forgive. They said I cared more for trappers than for blood. I gave food once to a white man who was starving. I spoke against a raid. That was enough. They tied me to a post in the Sunday. When they cut me free, they told me to walk away and never come back. So I walked. To here." Her voice didn't break. It didn't even waver. She told it like a ledger entry, what was taken, what was left. But I saw the line of her mouth tighten. She had repeated that story to herself enough times to sand it smooth, but the wound lived raw beneath. I didn't offer pity. Pity was a poor coin out here. Instead, I nodded and let the silence stand between us. We ate beans that morning, and though she gave me the larger portion, I slid half back to her. She didn't refuse. That was our first bargain, sealed not in words but in the arithmetic of survival. Later, she pulled a short-handled axe from behind a shelf and handed it to me. Wood. I took it outside. The air had turned knife, cold. The creek crusted with ice that cracked underfoot. The canyon's walls threw back the pale morning light in long, merciless slabs. I set the axe into a twisted block of mesquite, my ribs flaring with each strike. She worked beside me, carrying brush and stacking it against the dugout wall to keep sand from creeping in. She moved with quiet efficiency, her eyes never still. Even while she lifted branches, her gaze kept skimming the rim, searching for shapes that didn't belong. I had tracked outlaws across mesas and gullies, but I had never seen watchfulness worn so constantly. Vigilance was her second skin. When we hauled water from the creek, she slipped on the stone, and instinct had me catching her at the waist. For a moment she stayed there, her body pressed against mine, her breath fast. Her eyes met mine, guarded, searching, but she didn't pull away immediately. Something shifted in that instant, unspoken but undeniable, before she straightened and went back to her jug. Nights came hard in the canyon. The dugout was a coffin against the storm, yet inside the fire carved a small circle of warmth. I lay on the pallet she had given me, listening to her breathing. It was never deep. She slept as if the ground might crack open beneath her, as if the door might splinter at any sound. I understood. I too had slept like that for years, waiting for footsteps that never came. By the third day I tried to rise early, to work before the ache in my ribs grew sharp. I split wood, carried water, patched seams in the clay wall. Each act felt like penance, like paying back a debt I couldn't name. She didn't thank me, but she didn't stop me either. That, I decided, was thanks enough. It was during one of those mornings that I saw them silhouettes moving on the canyon rim. Just a flicker. 3 shadows against the pale sky, too far to mark faces, but close enough to twist my gut. I said nothing at first. When I carried wood inside, she looked at my face and knew before I spoke. Her hand froze on the blanket she was folding, her jaw tightening. That night, she pulled a small bow from a hollow behind the sleeping shelf. She pressed a carved charm to her lips, then set it back inside, as if placing a prayer where it might hold. I realized then that this dugout wasn't just shelter. It was also a trap if someone chose to close its mouth. One way in, no way out. I thought of leaving, of walking out before I brought more danger down on her head. But the idea tasted like ash. She had hauled me from the storm when she had no reason to. She had fed me, tended my wounds. Leaving now would be another kind of cowardice. I had run long enough. On the 4th morning, the frost lay heavy, and the dugout roof had cracked under the weight of sand. We patched it together, shoulder to shoulder. At one point, while she reached high, her braid brushed across my arm. She didn't move it. Neither did I. That evening we shared beans again. When I pushed half my bowl back to her, she let out the faintest breath, almost a laugh. It was the first sound of warmth I'd heard from her. It settled in me like an ember, refusing to die. Later, as I lay near the fire, I felt her shift closer. Her shoulder touched mine, tentative but steady. I didn't move. My ribs still throbbed, my soul still carried ghosts, but for the first time in years I felt the pull of belonging. Not to a place, not even to myself, but to another soul carrying her own exile. The days began to fall into a rhythm. At dawn we carried water. At midday, we mended seams or checked traps. At night, we sat near the fire, bowls in hand, silence between us less sharp than before. She showed me where she set snares along the creek. I followed, resetting one with her, our hands brushing in the wire. She didn't pull away. Her watchfulness never eased, though. Each time a bird startled from the rim, she froze. Each gust that carried sand down the canyon, her eyes went to the door. She never let herself forget the riders might return. I learned to mirror her caution, to move as if every shadow were alive. Once, while gathering wood, I asked, "Do you ever sing? Just for yourself?" She gave me a strange look. "Sometimes. Quiet, so no one hears. Does it help?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It keeps the heart from breaking." I understood. A man doesn't always need bullets to keep himself alive. Sometimes he needs a song only he can hear. It was on the 7th day that I found prints near the creek. Not ours. Hooves. At least 3 horses had passed in the night. My chest went tight. When I told her, she said nothing at first, only set her jaw and tightened the blanket around her shoulders. "They are searching," she said at last. "Scouts, maybe only passing, but they will return." Her words settled like sand in my lungs. There was no safe here, only borrowed time. That night, as we sat by the fire, she spoke again. "If they come, you must hide. Behind the shelf. They cannot find you. If they do, they kill us both." I wanted to argue, but I knew she was right. Pride was useless if it left both of us dead. Still, I looked into her dark eyes and said, "I won't let them take you alone." She held my gaze, steady and unblinking. "If you care for my life, you will stay hidden." The fire cracked between us. My ribs ached, my hands trembled. I nodded, though it tasted bitter. Days stretched into a fragile kind of peace. We worked, we watched, we ate in silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons. But beneath it all, danger breathed like a sleeping beast, waiting to wake. One evening, when the fire burned low, she sat closer than before. The coat I had given her hung loose at her shoulders, the fabric swallowing her frame. She rested her hand against my chest, fingers brushing the scar beneath my shirt. I caught her hand gently, holding it there. The silence between us shifted again, no longer suspicion, no longer only necessity. Something deeper, riskier, had taken root. Outside, the canyon wind sang. Inside, we sat unmoving, our hands locked together. For the first time since I had wandered into her storm, I felt the faint pull of tomorrow not as dread, but as possibility. The canyon, though, never forgets. The land is a ledger that keeps its accounts sharp, and on the 10th morning, when the air was brittle and the sky pale, I saw them again, shapes on the rim, more than before. 5 this time, their horses stamping in the frost. They lingered longer, watching. I carried the wood inside. She saw my face and knew. She didn't ask. She only set the bar across the door and turned to the hollow behind the shelf. Her hands shook as she pulled out the bow and arrows. "We will need more than this," she whispered. I sat near the fire, my revolver heavy in its cloth wrap. My hands trembled as I checked the cylinder, though I knew I hadn't fired a bullet in months. The weight of that boy's death pressed on me still, but death was coming either way. Better it found me standing beside her than cowering in the dark. That night, as the fire guttered low, Ilara leaned against me. Her head rested on my shoulder, her braids spilling down my chest. For a long time we didn't speak. The canyon groaned in its sleep. "You could still leave," she murmured at last. "Take the canyon floor, vanish before they return. No one would know." I closed my hand over hers. "I've been leaving my whole life. I won't leave this." Her breath caught. She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. And in that silence, I knew. Whatever storm was coming, we would meet it together. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The next morning came with a hard frost, the kind that glazed the edges of the creek bed and made the dugout door stiff in its frame. Rue woke to the scrape of metal on wood and saw Ilara at the fire, stirring beans with the tip of a knife. Her blanket had slipped from her shoulders, and the torn dress she wore was patched poorly at the seams with twine. He sat up slow, his ribs aching, and realized he had questions that had been turning in his head since the night before. He hadn't asked them yet, but he knew anyone listening to this story would wonder them all the same. Why was she still alone after months? Why did her people cast her out so harshly? And how had she survived in a desert that could kill a man in a single night? He cleared his throat, the sound a rough rasp in the quiet space. You said they would finish what they started if they found you. What did they start? Ilara's eyes stayed on the beans. She didn't answer right away, her hand steady as she stirred. When she did, her voice was flat, controlled, as if she were reciting a story she had told herself 1,000 times. They call me a traitor. They said I care more for the trappers than for blood. I spoke against a raid on a trading post. I gave food to a man who was starving, a white man. That was enough. They tied me to a post for a day and the Sunday. When they cut me free, they told me to walk and never come back. Rue studied her face. No trace of pity there, only a calm hardness. She had repeated this story to herself enough times that it had become fact, not a wound. Still, the way her jaw tightened told him the memory burned even now. He didn't press further. Instead, he asked the second question that had followed him since he stepped into her dugout. How do you keep food for months here? It's more than what you have on that shelf. Her mouth tugged into something almost like a smirk, a flash of something wry and defiant. You think I live only on beans? I trap rabbits. Sometimes a coyote if one strays. Trappers pass close when the weather is less harsh. I take what I need. Her eyes flicked to him, holding his gaze. And I'm not afraid to steal. Rue nodded once. He respected that answer. Survival didn't leave room for pride. After they ate, she handed him an axe with a short handle, the head dull but workable. Wood. We need more. He followed her outside, the cold biting sharper than yesterday. The canyon stretched wide, the sand piled against rock walls. He set the axe into a block of gnarled mesquite, his shoulders burning with the effort. Each strike sent a jolt of pain through his ribs, but he kept at it, teeth clenched. She watched from a few steps away, her jug balanced on her hip as she checked the sky, the rim of the canyon, every shadow. He noticed that she never let herself relax fully, not even for a single breath. At one point, she stepped close to show him how she stacked brush against the wall to keep sand from seeping in through the cracks. Her hand brushed his as they worked, and she didn't pull back. He caught the scent of her hair, smoke and desert earth, and felt a strange weight lift in his chest. By midday, they carried water again from the creek. The ice was thicker, and when Ilara leaned to break it, she slipped on the slick stone. Rue caught her at the waist before she fell. For a moment, she stayed there, her body pressed to his, her breath quick from the scare. Her eyes rose to his, guarded, but softer than before, and he felt something shift between them. Neither of them said it, but both knew it. When they came back to the dugout, she set 2 bowls on the ground again. As before, she pushed the larger one toward him. But this time, when he slid part of it back, she smiled faintly, a small, fleeting curve of her lips almost hidden in the shadow of the firelight. The silence that followed wasn't suspicion anymore. It was the beginning of trust, rough and unspoken. Rue understood then that neither of them would ask the other to leave. Not yet. And for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt the pull of belonging. The 4th morning in the canyon brought a sharper wind. Rue rose stiffly, his ribs still sore, though less than before, and noticed the dugout felt colder than it had on the earlier nights. He checked the roof seam and saw fresh sand had pressed into the clay, forming a thin crack where the air slipped through. He thought back on the days since he arrived, splitting wood, carrying water, patching walls, and realized what listeners might ask. How could this small dugout truly stand against a winter like this? How had Ilara survived here alone for months without someone's help? And what dangers truly pressed at the edges of this canyon? He decided to ask her as he worked. How long can this place hold if the sand keeps pushing? Ilara was kneeling near the fire, her hair in a single braid, her dress pulled tight at the waist with a strip of hide. She looked up at the roof seam, then back at him, Long enough. I mended every storm. The trappers dug it strong. They left. I stayed. Alone is harder, but no one tells you to leave. He studied her as she said it. Alone meant safety from her people. But it also meant exposure if anyone else found her. And what about them, he asked. The ones you said would finish what they started. Do they come this way? Her jaw tensed, and for a moment, she didn't answer. Then she said quietly, sometimes. Scouts. They check for food, for signs. I watch the rim. Hey there. Friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you. The first sound was the door grinding in its frame, a stiff-mouthed protest as I shouldered against the weight of drifted sand. I pried it open half a hand's width, just enough to taste morning cold as a tin cup and sharp enough to shave with. The canyon beyond wore a new face, all plains and powder, a map redrawn overnight by the same wind that wanted us gone. I stood there a moment with my shoulder set in the wood, breathing like I was afraid of waking the day. Behind me, Ilara tied back her hair with a strip of hide. The gesture was clean, practiced, part prayer, part armor. She stepped around me to the narrow crack, took in the same white quiet I was counting, and nodded as if we'd been given instructions neither of us had asked for. Without a word, she handed me the short-handled axe. Work first, fear later. We made a corridor with the axe and a dented tin pan, ferrying sand in slow plates to toss from the lip, careful to lay it where it wouldn't slide back. Before the sun cleared the rim, we'd opened the mouth of the dugout and stitched the roof seam with fresh clay and brush. Every stroke of my knife along the willow bindings sang in my ribs, but the ache was an old acquaintance now, one I didn't respect enough to let boss me. Ilara set coffee to boil with 2 guilty pinches of grounds, the kind of economy that sits in a ledger with your name in the margin. When she passed me the tin, her knuckles were a bruise of cold. I folded both hands around the cup and blew until the steam stung my eyes. You saw them again? She asked, gaze on the roofline, not me. 3, maybe 4, I said. Just a taste on the rim. She nodded once. They are weighing the canyon. Men like that do not rush into places with only one door. It has a second door, I said, though at that moment it was only a sentence said out loud. She tipped her head my way, the barest ask of a question. We carve one, I answered. Ilara set down the coffee before she drank. In that one small act I learned more about her heart than from a dozen stories. She didn't smile, but the hard set of her mouth loosened, just a fraction, the way a rope eases when a horse finally stops pulling. The decision didn't open the sky or sweeten the water. It just gave the day a spine. We started at the back wall where the clay bellied to meet a seam of softer earth. She fetched the chisel head she'd salvaged from some lost wagon, a square of iron with a mouth chipped crooked, and I married it to the axe handle with rawhide, twisting until it took. The first bite into the wall shivered through the dugout like a warning to its bones. Dust lifted in a gold breath. Ilara knelt with her basket to catch the loam, fingers quick and blunt, the way a person's hands learn to be when they have to be both gentle and fast to live. We cut a slot 2 men wide if the men were starving, and 1 woman wide if she turned a shoulder to sideways. It ran uphill, because we'd learned from water. It seeks down. Life runs for the high crack. I braced with willow poles stolen from the creek's private country. Ilara packed the walls with wet clay, knuckling it tight, speaking to it under her breath in a language that wore smoke and stone. She said little in English while she worked, but the set of her jaw told me more than the wind. By noon my shirt was a second skin. Sweat carved roads for the dust to follow, and my breath burned like I'd been drinking lamp oil. We crawled through the first yard to test it. I went forward belly down with a pole under my forearms, and Ilara came behind with the basket, pushing with her feet. The earth held. Outside, the slot led us up under a lip of brush on a ledge I would have sworn was blank as a hammered coin yesterday. From there I saw our doorway as a black stamp in the side of the world, small enough to look defenseless, mean enough to pretend it wasn't. We lay there a minute, cheek to stone, sharing a breath like conspirators. Below, A wind devil took a ribbon of sand and twined it into the air, as delicate as a dancer's hand. Ilara's shoulder touched mine. She didn't take it back, and I didn't take it for more than it was. Proof two bodies can learn the same weather. Again, she said. And we slid into the seam and carried the earth off our future with both hands. By twilight, we had what you'd call a way out if you were telling the story to someone who wanted to believe it. I stacked brush to shelter the new mouth. Ilara tamped the last of the clay with a smooth river stone and sat back on her heels, wind-stitching hair against her forehead. I watched her, as if watching could salt the moment to keep it from spoiling. The day had thieved color from her face, left hollows under her eyes like thumbprints, and still she looked like the answer to a question I'd asked the desert 100 times and never expected to hear. She rose deliberate, crossed the dugout in 2 strides, and pulled from beneath the sleeping shelf the flat stone that didn't belong. In the hollow waited the bow, 7 arrows fletched with crow feather, and a small carved thing I'd seen her kiss but hadn't been introduced to. She held it out to me now. It was a bird notched out of juniper, lines plain as bread, form true, everything unnecessary left in the shavings. "My father cut this," she said. "He said, 'Keep the bird, and you'll always remember the way home.' When they cast me out, I kept it anyway." Her thumb rubbed the wing until it shone with the kind of polish only grief and time can give. "Now I think maybe it can be our home, not the one behind us." "You're telling me you believe in omens?" I asked, because my mouth sometimes breaks things my heart would protect. She met my look. "I believe in patterns. Wind, water, men. They repeat. If we stay blind, we die." Men repeat," I said. "That part I know." Her eyes didn't flinch. "Do you?" I didn't answer. Not then. We ate what the snare had written for us. The rabbit went on an iron rod over a careful flame, and the smell climbed inside my head and set a chair down. I cut the meat and passed her the larger share, because hunger had a longer claim on her bones than mine. She pushed half back, and I didn't argue. The argument was the old language. The arithmetic was the new. When the light thinned to iron, we set the bar across the door and lay with the fire between us. In the redfall, her face softened into a map you could read with your thumbs. A small scar at the temple, 2 more at the jaw that looked like frostbite but weren't. A fine seam along her collarbone. No dressmaker put there. I didn't ask the stories. A person puts their history on the table when they intend to share it. Ilara wasn't dealing yet. She watched the flames and I watched the places the flames chose not to touch, and we let our heat be a third thing in the room, and not the only thing. I must have slept because I woke. Dark had rolled close. The wind took a rest it hadn't earned. I heard a child's laugh, light and quick. I sat up so fast, my ribs forgot themselves. The laugh came again, more a muscle in memory than sound. Ilara was already upright, one hand on my wrist. "It is a fox," she said low. "The little ones play." I let the air out like an apology. Whatever I'd heard wasn't fox. It was a boy, 10 years old, and he was not in this canyon. Ilara's hand stayed on my wrist a moment longer than necessary, then left. She wrapped her blanket tight as a vow and lay down again with her back to the fire and her face to the door. A person sleeps the way they've learned to wake. Morning found prints near the creek too big for foxes and too square for deer. Hooves. 4 sets. The sand had done us a favor and iced their edges, but not enough to hide count or direction. They'd come along the rim and cut south, then climbed to a shoulder where a man could listen without being seen. I put my palm in the nearest print and felt the old curse in my blood begin to stir. You track, you follow, you finish. Not today, I told the part of me that listened and galloped off after anything that smelt like a trail. Not like that. That's... When I came back to the dugout with the news sitting like a hot rivet under my tongue, Ilara was mending her dress with that stubborn needle and thread that wanted to fight her. She looked up, saw my face, and didn't need the words. She tied off the stitch with her teeth and set the dress aside. "They will test," she said. "They will press the door with words first. If it opens soft, they bring hands. If hands fail, they bring fire." She nodded toward the sleeping shelf. "You will fit behind the curtain. Do not cough even once. I have a better coward's trick, I said. Her eyebrow rose like a question learning to walk. We give them a door to push on and a door to walk through, and they choose wrong. False face, she said, understanding quick and clean. You know this like a coyote knows a trap. I've said both, I said. Now and again I've been both. We burned the day into preparations. I cut mesquite with the axe and stacked it high as a man just left of the door, the kind of clumsy that reads, "Panic if you're a hunter, and busy if you're a fool." Under the woodpile we laid a run of thin stones like a child's game. Step there and the pile lets go, noiseless as a snake in sand. On the ledge above the real door's lintel, Elara nested 3 flat rocks the size of bread loaves. A tug on a brush twist would bring them down, not enough to kill a man, enough to make him choose his next thought slowly. Inside, we laid a thick braid of grass across the clay floor like a seam. Elara showed me how to light it and make it smolder without smoke, a fuse that could carry fire to a pan of wet cedar chips. Smoke is a kind of gun if you keep your head about it. The dugout would look like it was choking. A man who wanted to be a hero would kick in the door, cough, and stagger in blind. That is what men who think they know women expect. Disorder, fright, coughing. We would give them a play to act in and take our bows for them. While we worked, she told me a piece of her story she'd hidden along the wall with the bow. Not because I asked, but because she needed to lay the weight down long enough to roll her shoulders. Vance is not my father's name, she said, as if admitting a lie to a priest who'd already heard it confessed by 10 parishioners. A trader taught it to me when I was small. He spoke it like a coin. He said it would keep doors open I could not open with my own tongue. He gave the name and took other things. Her eyes were dark, not with tears, with ash. When I spoke against the raid, the women said it was because I carried Vance in my mouth. Perhaps it was. Perhaps they were right to cut me loose. I do not know right and wrong the way the elders do anymore. I only know what lets us see another morning. Right and wrong aren't the elders alone, I said. They belong to whoever's awake when the sun comes up. You speak like a preacher with no church, she said. But she didn't say it mean. I had a church, I answered. I burned it down when I taught myself how to aim. Her hand stilled, then returned to work. She did not say the boy's name. I did not have one to offer. We ate beans and bone broth that night, and I took the smaller share, and she let me, which told me we were either family or foolish. When the fire slumped, she moved near. Not bold, not shy, just honest about the shape of the room and the weather inside it. Tell me the rule you live by now, she said. Not the rule you learned, the one you chose. I stared at the dark seam above the door, where one of our stones waited to be a sentence in a language some men only learn once it's been spoken. Do no harm if you can help it, I said. Failing that, take the harm yourself. Failing that, spread it fair. That is not a crow rule, she said. It's not a white man's rule either, I told her. It's just what keeps me from biting through my own tongue. She considered that. Then, with a carefulness I will remember if I'm ever drowned and pulled up again by strangers, she slid her hand into mine. The heat of it rounded off the corners of the day. We sat like that a long time with our palms learning the map of each other's work, and the wind outside measuring itself against the door and finding it wanted. Sometime toward morning the canyon changed its mind. You could feel it as surely as a horse feels, a rider's weight shift a stride before the hand on the neck. A hush came, not peace, but its cousin, as if the land had leaned in to listen and didn't want to miss a thing. Elara's head lay against my shoulder. Her braid had found the hollow at my collarbone, and my shirt had found a way to be softer where her cheek pressed it. The word that came to me was belonging. It didn't come often and never stayed long. We didn't get a sunrise. We got a blade of light across the door and the dry scrape of hoof iron on stone. Not the loose clatter of passing, the careful testing of a thing you mean to break but don't want to pay for with your own blood. Elara left my side like a shadow, learns to stand alone when a cloud moves off the Sunday. She put her finger to her lips and then pointed toward the sleeping shelf. I shook my head once and touched the back door. 2 strokes, one for I go, one for quiet. Her look took me in from hat to heel, measured cost and benefit like a woman who has had to do sums with lives in the columns, and she nodded not because she was convinced, but because saying no would cost more than it saved. The crawl took my breath in small coins. At the ledge, I lay with my head in the brush and watched our door shrink to a handprint. The riders came into view one by one the way trouble does when you've already counted it in your gut. 5. 2 grays, 1 sorrel, 1 paint, 1 sway-backed bay built more from hate than oats. The men wore their coats wrong for the weather, collars up, hats pulled low, the costume of men who like being hard to see. They didn't come straight to the door. They circled the little yard where the sand drift ended, and the gnarled mesquite marked the place we set traps for ourselves, so we wouldn't forget how heavy kindness can be. One dismounted and bent to look at the sand, like it had something to tell him. It did. It lied. He walked to the woodpile and put his palm on the cut ends. He was testing for warmth, whether we'd split this morning or last night or last week. Alara had taught me to smear dust on fresh breaks. He came away with a clean hand. That, and the new drift at the door, might have been enough to decide him if his blood had been content with patience. But men like this don't come to be convinced. They come to be proven right. He lifted his hand to the others. 2 dismounted and drew their pistols the way you draw a breath before a shout. Alara opened the door before they could kick it. She filled the frame like a woman who has learned what it takes to be mistaken for a wall. "Morning," she said, her voice wrapped in calm and a thing that wasn't calm at all. The leader, old before his time or young with a mean father, smiled without his eyes. "Looking for a stray," he said. "Passed this way." "Strays pass every day," Alara answered. She didn't hold the door wider. She didn't try to close it. That patience twice again. "This house holds 1 woman. Let the wind count with you if your eyes are tired." The leader glanced at the man by the woodpile. Woodpile gave him nothing. He stepped to the door. "I'll just look," he said, the way a man says, "I'll just take," when the taking is already done in his head. Alara stood aside half a shoulder. He had to turn to pass her. He did not like that. He stepped inside. 2 behind, 2 outside to watch the yard. He breathed in shallow against the smoke we'd coaxed from the cedar pan, not enough to choke, enough to pinch. His eyes swept once and came to the sleeping shelf. "There," he said, and lifted the curtain quick. Behind it lay a blanket tied over 2 baskets so it rose like a back, the kind of shape men mistake for a person when their fear tells them what to see. He ripped the blanket and knocked 1 basket sideways. Dried roots skittered like mice. The other basket held nothing but a folded dress with a neat mend along 1 seam. The men laughed the way boys do when they knock over a thing they can pretend they never wanted. The leader turned on Alara. "Who's been eating your beans?" he asked. Alara took her time answering. "That was the first lesson the desert taught me that I didn't learn from a gun hand. Someone else's speed is not your speed." "I have," she said, "and the fox. He comes to listen. He likes coffee." The youngest of them, bare face, old eyes, snorted. "You lie like a preacher's daughter," he said, and there was something in his voice not yet fully cruel, which made me more afraid of him, not less. Young men with a foot in both countries make worse soldiers than those who were born to a single law. The leader moved to the bar that lay leaned against the wall, lifted it, tested its weight like a club. "You hear that?" he asked the room. "She keeps a bar to lock out the wind." He set it down slow, thinking. "Tracks come in," he said, "and they don't go out." Ilara's face didn't change. "The sand moves." She nodded to the door. "You can watch it move if you have nothing better." And he stepped close enough I could have put a bullet in the crown of his hat if I'd had the will to unmake a man at that range. His hand lifted maybe to her cheek, maybe to her throat. The difference between the two is the difference between men you can teach and men you must bury. The brush cord above the door twitched, not because I pulled it, because Alara had found her own timing and didn't need me to set it. The 3 flat rocks dropped like a sentence at the end of a paragraph. The leader flinched backward out of pride, not fear, but his men stumbled without choice, and one of them went down on the thin stones under the woodpile. The whole stack slid like a book pushed from a table. It didn't bury him. It held him the way the desert holds a man who has told 1 lie too many. The youngest swore and went for his gun. Alara had the bow in her hand already. She didn't draw. She only held it as if the room would turn its head to look at whatever had the cleanest shape of threat. The youngest saw a string and a stick and called it nothing. He lifted his pistol and she lifted the bow, and neither of them fired because the leader's laugh cut the air. "Well now," he said. "Look at that, she's clever." He meant the word like insult and compliment both. "But clever women bleed like the rest." He waved his men back with a casual flick that told me his mouth was a long way from his fingers. They stepped out into the yard, shaking dust from their hats. The man under the woodpile cussed and elbowed himself free, and no one helped him. They mounted. The leader looked down at Ilara from the saddle, a long beat. "If we come back and find tracks have grown a second set of feet," he said, "we stop asking the wind and start asking you." He tipped his hat as if tipping could salt his threat sweet. Then they turned in one piece like a team that had learned to take a curve without thinking about the wheel. I stayed still until the canyon swallowed the last of their horses and the worst of my shaking. Then I slid down into our house and stood with my back against the wall because the air in my lungs had taken on weight, and a man needs help to breathe some days. Ilara put the bow back in the hollow and the curtain back over the shelf, and she looked at me not to ask if I'd been afraid, "What use is that?" but to take measure of what the fear had burned away or revealed. "They will come again," she said. "No flourishes, no wishes dressed as declarations. And they will not ask the wind next time." "They won't have to," I answered. "We'll be gone." She tilted her head. "Running again?" I rubbed the scar along my jaw, not because it itched, because some old habits want something to do when the new ones haven't grown their own hands yet. Not running, choosing. I pointed to the back wall. "We built the choice. We use it." She sat, drew her knees in, and wrapped the blanket around like she was collecting herself where the cold couldn't get at her. "Where?" she asked. "Where is not hunted?" "I don't know," I said, "but I know where we die if we stay, and I am tired of letting men who don't know my name decide the shape of my grave." Ilara studied my face a long time, then reached into the hollow again. When her hand came out, it held something wrapped in doeskin, flat and heavy. She set it in my palm. I unrolled the skin. Inside lay a revolver, not mine. Smaller than the Colt I'd sold, a 5-shot with a square back and a cylinder worn slick where a thumb had worried it. Clean, oiled with something that smelt like juniper and patience. "I took it from a trader," she said. "He took more from me. Keep it, or throw it in the creek. But choose with your eyes open." I held the weight and felt the boy I'd killed open his eyes in my chest. I saw his hand where it'd been in life, small and dirty, clutching at a man who didn't deserve him. I saw it open in death, fingers slack, and the coin of a son on the nail beds. I looked at the gun and set it down between us like a guest who would only stay if invited. "If I pick it up," I said, "I am not the same man who sold the last one." Ilara's gaze did not move from mine. "Good," she said. "That man almost died in the sand." I picked it up. The cylinder turned clean. The hammer clocked with a voice old as brass. I thumbed back and let it down slow. Then I wrapped it in the doeskin again and tucked it under the blanket at my side. I didn't feel powerful. I felt like a man who'd agreed to speak a language he had sworn off because the only words that would save the house were written in it. We packed what there was to pack that afternoon into the small space misery calls generous. 2 blankets, the beans, a twist of salt, the bow, the arrows, the little carved bird. Ilara tied the bird to the bowstring near the grip, where her hand would find it without looking. I took the chisel off the axe and left the axe head under the brush by the new door in case we had to dig past something ugly and close. When the light folded, we sat to make the plan again in words, so our bodies wouldn't argue with us in the dark out of habit. If riders came at dawn, we'd go at night. If they came at night, we'd wait for noon's glare and slip along the cliff where a man's eyes are drunk with brightness. If they set the door to burning, we'd flood the floor with the water we'd cached and turn smoke toward them with the cedar pan. If they brought more men than we had lies for, we'd leave the food and take only what we could carry high without knocking our hats on the seam. "Out where?" Ilara asked again, not to pester. "To keep the shape of the future solid enough to point at." "North," I said. because I knew the country by the kind of pain it offers, and north offers the kind you can walk through without your tongue cracking. There's a ridge line where the stone turns redder, and beyond it a wash that runs late when the winter's generous. There's a box canyon with two mouths, if memory didn't rot on me. We can make a camp there not fit for a poem, but good enough for sleeping with your boots off. She listened like the canyon did, taking it in, storing it for the echo later. If your memory lies, she said. Then we make new water, I answered, or learn to be less thirsty. Night came like a long note. We banked the fire and lay side by side with a hand's width between our shoulders, because closeness is something you walk into, not jump. Somewhere between my breath and hers we forgot to keep the space. Her head found my chest, my palm found the curve of her braid, where it lay like a drawn river across her back. If the dugout had been a ship, we'd have sworn we felt the sea. "Tell me a piece of your first life," she said into my shirt. "Not the worst piece. A good one." I thought I didn't have any left that hadn't rusted. Then one came small, bright as a coin you find in the dirt when you're not looking for it. "When I was 12, I said, I could throw a lariat clean over the church bell from the far fence. The preacher claimed it was the devil's doing. I knew it was practice." She laughed once into me, a sound with the weight of a whole winter behind it. "When I was a girl," she said, "I could run along the top of the corral fence faster than the boys, 2 steps to their 3. My mother said a woman should move as if she knows the world is watching, not to invite it, to warn it." We lay with that between us a while, 2 children in 2 rooms of the same house, finally meeting in the hall. Before dawn, a cloud found the stars and set its shoulder to the rim. We felt the shift pressure in the ears, a breath that wasn't ours moving through our lungs. Ilara touched my arm and I sat up. We didn't speak. She wrapped the carved bird's thong twice around her wrist and tucked the bow across her back. I slid the revolver into a cloth and tied it under my shirt, the way men carry shame and medicine and other things you hope not to need. We doused the coals and left 2 pieces of sweet wood under them, like a blessing for the next poor souls who might need the place. If no next souls came, the wood would lie there and think about fire until thinking was all it knew. At the back wall we unseated the clay plug and leaned into the seam. The earth that had learned us the day before took us back with the quiet ease a friend does when you come to their door at an hour you shouldn't. We made the climb into the brush with our mouths full of breath we needed and our hands full of stone that hadn't betrayed us yet. Ilara went first along the ledge, her feet memorizing a path that wasn't one, her hand finding holds that looked like air. I followed with the panic falling off me in little pieces as the cliff took me in. At the bend we stopped. Light came there early, washing the stone with a color the mind wants to call blood but isn't. We lay flat and watched the door. It looked small and honest and lonesome. No men came. No horses marked the rim. The canyon kept its own counsel and gave us no hint of whether it meant to bless or bury us. "Now," Ilara said, and the word was different in her mouth than in mine. In mine it had always meant, later, if I live. In hers it meant the only time a person owns. We moved. The ledge narrowed to a ribbon, then fattened to a shelf, then fell away into a chute of broken rock. We slid down on our heels and our prayer bones. At the bottom the wash waited with its old gossip stones, telling the sand about floods that meant to kill them and failed. We crossed where the bed was shallow and climbed an apron of talus to a crease in the cliff that pretended to be a shadow until you asked it for more and then gave you a handhold the size of grace. By the time the sun found us, we'd set 2 bends between ourselves and the house. We crouched under a lintel of rock where a man could drink shade without apology. My chest worked like a bellows I didn't own, and my ribs sang a song I didn't ask for, and my feet had turned the nails at the end of my toes into hot coins. I grinned anyway. Ilara did not. But there was a brightness at the corner of her mouth I had not seen before. Hope doesn't smile wide. It shows its teeth a little and waits to see if you mind. We licked water off a rock with our palms and ate a handful of meal that tasted like dust and forgiveness. We slept in 2 turns, she first while I watched the rim, me next while she counted the shapes that moved and didn't. When we woke, the canyon had gone quiet in that way. A man who is about to be hit goes quiet a breath before the fist lands. Horses. We heard them first. Then we felt them through the stone, a low drum some ancestor built into this place to warn the careful. The riders came along the rim paths quick and sure now, with the kind of certainty borrowed from men with more men behind them. They made for the dugout like it was a debt that had come due. We couldn't see our door from where we crouched. We could see the idea of it in the way the riders bunched, and the way one gestured sharp and another dismounted, and the others fanned to keep the canyon from growing teeth and biting them silly. They went in. We knew the sounds our little traps made because we had heard them with our eyes open. We heard them now with our mouths closed, a slide of wood, a curse, a laugh, the kind of laugh that makes a man lonely in a crowd. No gunshots, no scream, which told me two things. The men did not find what they wanted, and the men had not yet decided to teach the dugout how to burn. Ilara's hand went to the bird bound to her wrist. Mine went to the revolver under my shirt. We didn't draw either. We counted breaths. After a time so wide it could have been an hour or a minute. A canyon's clock is not a man's. The riders came out and stood, looking at nothing like men who want to blame a piece of land for lying. The leader kicked the doorpost once. The post stood, because it had not learned to bend for this kind of meanness. Then the men mounted and rode not away but along the rim to the north, right where we meant to go. Ilara looked at me and did not say the word now. She looked at the cliff above us and did not say climb. She looked at the wash and did not say hide. She did none of that because trust is not a thing you write down for a jury. It is a palm offered on bad ice. I took hers and put my weight on it and we stood. We did not go north. We went east into the sun's teeth, the way a person walks into truth when a lie would be kinder. The cliff took us. The talus tried to return us to the wash and failed because we were meaner than stone that day. We cut across a broken saddle and came down into a draw that wore cottonwood like a shawl left behind by a woman who always meant to come back for it and never did. There, in a pocket of shade so tight it had to be shared, we sat and made the kind of plan you make with your body after your mouth has run out of cleverness. We would circle south by noon, then west by afternoon, then let the canyon spit us north 2 days later, at a place that made a fool of compass needles. The men who hunted us would expect speed. We would give them patience. They would look for tracks in the obvious places. We would leave ours where only foxes and women looking for willow bark bother to look. At dusk, Ilara touched the bruise at my ribs that had learned my breathing and fallen in step with it. "You are running," she said softly, not accusing. "I have been," I said. "But not from them." "From what then?" "The kind of man I used to be," I said. "I am tired of his company." Then, she thought about that. Then she stood, leaned her forehead to mine, and closed her eyes like a woman who has understood a prayer she said all her life for the first time. "So be it," she whispered. "We will walk with the new man." We moved at night, thin as wire, bodies keeping to the stripe of shadow where the cliff makes a road for snakes and ghosts. By day we became 2 extra rocks under a shelf or a brush shadow pretending to have a heartbeat. Twice we heard riders above, and twice we heard them swear at the heat and the not knowing, and once we smelled their tobacco. I counted their matches. A careful man uses 2, a fool uses 4. They had 3 men and 9 matches worth of patience left, by my reckoning. A good number to play against. On the second night, the wind shifted and brought with it a smell that did not belong to men or horses or creosote. It was a cat smell, musky, old as hunger. Ilara's spine tightened under my arm. "Mountain lion," she breathed into my shirt as if she didn't want the word to hear itself and show up bold. "Big?" I asked. It was a fool's question. She answered with the pressure of her fingers on my wrist, "Bigger than a story wants, smaller than the worst thing that ever found a child alone." We changed our path by a hair. Not to avoid it, there is no avoiding a thing like that if it wants you. To step like you are not prey. There is a difference in the sound your feet make when you remember you have teeth. Before dawn of the 3rd day, the canyon we'd been aiming for since we cut the back door a lifetime ago opened her mouth. 2 entrances, as promised. A notch on the north side and a shoulder on the west, thin as a tightrope. We took the shoulder because a man who has admitted he is tired of running chooses the harder grace. At the top, The ground rolled out into a pocket of old flood-laid earth. There we found a place for a fire that would not tell the sky about itself. There we found a slab for a bed that had collected a century of sun and still had some to offer. Ilara set the carved bird on the stone, and we both looked at it without touching because it had brought us farther than any map I'd ever bought. We didn't speak of staying. We didn't speak of leaving. We made a small circle, as tight as a wedding ring if you have to compare, and we sat in it and let ourselves be two people instead of two brands of damage. I said once the desert would not keep you, Ilara said after a while. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps it will keep us both. Or we will keep each other, I said. The desert doesn't need our help. She smiled then, the first true one I'd seen set all the way on her face. It changed the room, though the room in question was a canyon with no roof. She leaned into me, and I leaned into her. When our mouths met, it was careful at first, because we had not earned boldness yet. Then it was not careful at all, because some forms of life are loud even when you try to keep them quiet. Her hand found the scar under my shirt and laid a blessing on it that a priest would mistake for sin. My hand found the hollow at the base of her throat and measured the way her breath argued down the fear that had set up house there. We stopped before stopping would be hard. We lay with our foreheads together, and the word home walked in without knocking and didn't apologize. Tomorrow, I said, we go down into the wash, pick up the water, and climb north to that second mouth. If riders come behind, we leave them the kind of story they want. If they don't, we leave ourselves the kind we need. Ilara nodded. We will carry the bird for both, she said, and tied the thong at her wrist tighter. I slept then, but not the sleep of a man waiting to die. I slept as if I believed in days like a fool or a child. When I woke, the sky was making a new face and the canyon smelled like it wanted to forgive something. I stood to stretch and the world broke in half on a sound I hadn't planned for. Not the far iron of hooves, not the dry gasp of a lit fuse. A growl low and wet as a wound close, too close. I turned and saw prints at the lip of the wash below our shelf. Feline, heavy, fresh enough to shine. The hair along my arms rose like grain under wind. Ilara, I said without turning my head, because some angels come in through the ear. It's not the riders. What then? The kind of law that crawls on its belly and doesn't recognize our rules. Oh? She came to my side and we looked down together at the silver line of the creek we hadn't met yet, and the shadow under the cottonwood that wasn't one. The cat moved like water inside shadow. Beautiful, single-minded. The world's original citizen. Collecting taxes from anyone who forgot it was king first. I felt for the revolver under my shirt, and felt my old life sit up in bed and look at me. I put my palm flat against the grip, and let my breath find a count that didn't wobble. I don't want to go back, I told her and myself and the piece of the canyon that hears men when they confess. Then don't, she said, and put her hand on my back between my shoulder blades where a man keeps more sins than he can name. Go forward, I nodded. It wasn't a heroic gesture. It was a man's neck remembering it can move. We watched the cat watch the world we meant to enter. Somewhere behind us, very far or very near, a stone rolled under a horse's hoof or under the foot of a truth that doesn't need a rider. The day inhaled. I set my hand on the gun, and Ilara set her hand on my hand, and we waited for the moment when decision and necessity become the same word. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. The storm passed by morning, leaving the canyon floor buried in white sand. The dugout door groaned when Rue shoved it open, the sandbank nearly to his chest. He climbed out first, boots sinking deep, and dragged a narrow path with the axe handle. Ilara followed, jug in hand, her breath showing in sharp bursts as she moved carefully across the drift. For the first time since he arrived, he saw her laugh faintly when she nearly fell waist-deep in the sand and pulled herself out, shaking her head at him as if daring him to comment. It struck him that listeners would wonder, could these two, so different, really share anything beyond the need to survive? Could a banished crow woman and a war-worn drifter find trust strong enough to hold against the weight of the world? Rue didn't have the answer yet, but something inside him was already forming one. At the creek, the ice was thicker. Rue used the butt of the axe to break it while Ilara crouched close, scooping water into the jug. When she handed it up, her fingers brushed his, cold and trembling, and for a moment she let her hand linger against his glove before pulling it back. Neither said a word. They returned to the dugout with their clothes stiff from frost, and Ilara worked quickly to strip the wet blanket from her shoulders, hanging it by the fire. Rue sat on the ground, rubbing his hands together, his ribs aching from the work. He noticed her shivering and passed his coat toward her. She hesitated, eyes narrowing. "You'll freeze." "I've frozen before," he said, the words heavy with a past he was tired of carrying. "Don't make me watch it happen again." She took it finally, slipping it over her torn dress. The coat swallowed her frame, sleeves too long, shoulders too broad, but the way she pulled it tight said more than thanks. She settled near the fire, her eyes dropping to the embers, her lips pressing together as if holding back something she hadn't said in a long time. Rue leaned back against the wall, studying her. The questions pressed at him again, the kind any listener would ask. Why hadn't she left this canyon? Why hadn't she sought another tribe? Another camp? Another way? He asked it plain. You could have gone anywhere. Why stay here? Ilara's eyes lifted, dark and steady. Where would I go? To the people who call me a traitor? To the towns that spit at me because of my blood? Here. No one tells me I don't belong. The truth of it sat heavy between them. Rue understood more than he wanted to admit. He too had nowhere left to belong. No one waiting. No one calling him home. For both of them, this canyon wasn't a choice. It was the last place the world hadn't taken. As night fell, the fire burned low. Ilara sat close enough that her knee brushed his. The coat hung loose at her chest where the button strained, the firelight catching the line of her collarbone and the curve of her throat. Rue tried not to stare, but the air between them was different now, charged in a way that made silence louder. She shifted, her braids slipping across her shoulder, and her eyes found his. For a long moment, they only looked at one another. No words, just the weight of weeks of loneliness pressing into the space they shared. Then she leaned slow and steady, and pressed her lips to his. It was light at first, uncertain, but he answered, his hand rising to her jaw. The kiss deepened, careful but sure, heat mixing with the sound of their breaths. Her hand slid to his chest, fingers pressing against the scar beneath his shirt, as if testing whether he was real. He drew her closer, his thumb brushing the side of her neck. And for the first time since he had stumbled into the canyon, he felt the ache of survival give way to something else, something that made sense. When they pulled apart, both of them stayed close, foreheads nearly touching. She whispered, "You can go when the thaw comes." "I could," he answered, his voice low, steady, "but I won't." She searched his face as if weighing the truth of it, then let out a slow breath. Instead of pulling away, she stayed beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. The fire crackled, the wind moved across the canyon, and for the first time, the dugout felt less like a place to hide and more like a place to live. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. The next day began uneasy, the kind of stillness that made Rue's skin prickle. The sand had hardened to a crust. The canyon was quiet, except for the distant call of crows. He rose before Ilara stirred, stepping outside to check the path they had cleared. His boots broke through the icy surface, each crunch too loud in his ears. He scanned the rim, and that was when he saw them. Fresh tracks pressed into the sand, not theirs. Horses, at least 3. When he came back inside, Ilara was sitting at the fire, her hair loose around her shoulders. She saw his face and tensed before he even spoke. "Riders?" she asked. He nodded, past the rim. "In the night. Might come back." Her eyes dropped to the fire for a long moment. Then she stood, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Then we prepare." This was the part any listener would wonder. How could they possibly defend a dugout carved in stone? One door, and no way out. And what would happen if her people learned she was sheltering a white man? Those questions needed answers, and Ilara gave them in the way she moved. She knelt by the sleeping shelf and pulled the flat stone aside, revealing the hollow where she had stored her bow and arrows. She handed Rue a small knife, its edge dull but still dangerous. If they come inside, you fight only if there is no other way. If they find you, they will kill us both. Rue studied her, the firelight throwing shadows across her face. And what if they already suspect? What if they come to be sure? Then I lie, she said simply. I tell them I am alone. I tell them you were never here. Her jaw tightened. And you stay hidden, no matter what you hear. He wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. Survival wasn't about pride. It was about making it to the next day. He slid the knife into his boot, then set his revolver back under the blanket, wrapped tight in cloth to keep the shine hidden. By midday, the sound of hooves reached them. Rue's chest clenched. He held her, his chin resting against her hair, her body tense, as if waiting for a knock. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw. They will come again. They never forget. Rue's grip tightened. Then we'll be ready next time, both of us. She looked at him then, long and searching. And for the first time, she didn't try to push away the truth that they were no longer two strangers caught in the same storm. They were bound now by choice, by danger, by the silent promise that neither would face it alone. The air inside the dugout stayed heavy long after the riders were gone. Rue sat by the fire, his shirt clinging damp to his back, while Ilara moved restlessly from shelf to door, her hands never still. Both of them knew the truth that listeners would also demand answers to. How could a single dugout with one bar of wood on the door keep them safe if the riders returned with suspicion in their eyes? What had they done to prepare beyond hiding in a crawl space? And why, despite the danger, did Rue remain instead of leaving under cover of night? Ilara finally stopped pacing and crouched near him. We cannot wait for them to come again. If they search next time, they will find you. Rue looked into the fire, jaw tight. He thought of the years he had spent drifting from camp to camp, always moving on before anyone could know him well enough to judge him. He had nowhere else to go. Nothing but worn boots and a revolver that hadn't seen proper oiling in months. Then we make this place stronger, he said. The plan began with the back wall. Ilara showed him a shallow seam of stone where the earth softened. Together they worked with the dull knife, a chisel head she had salvaged from a trapper's wagon, and their bare hands. The hours dragged, but soon a narrow tunnel began to take shape, an escape route that led upward to a ledge shielded by brush. Rue braced it with willow poles, while Ilara packed clay against the sides to keep it from collapsing. The work left their hands raw and bleeding, but when they finally crawled through to test it, both felt a weight lift. They would not be trapped like animals in a cage. Afterward, Rue cut more wood than before, stacking it high against the wall outside to serve as a false barrier. Ilara gathered stones from the creek bed, arranging them in piles near the door where they could be used to block or defend if forced. She explained in a quiet, steady tone that listeners would want to hear why she knew so much about defense. My father taught me before they cast me out. He was a scout. He said a home must never have only one way out. I thought I would never use those lessons, but I kept them. As night fell, the two of them sat by the fire with their backs against the wall, exhaustion pressing down, but relief sharper. Ilara's braid had loosened, strands of black hair falling across her face. She was wrapped in Rue's coat again, the torn dress beneath slipping open at the neckline where the stitching had failed. She didn't try to hide it anymore. He tried not to stare, but the quiet between them had changed. No longer just about survival. She turned her head toward him, eyes reflecting the firelight. "You could still leave," she said. Her voice carried no challenge, only a tired honesty. "Take the tunnel, walk the canyon, vanish before they return. No one would blame you." Rue let out a slow breath. His ribs ached, his hands throbbed, but none of that weighed more than the thought of walking away. "I've had enough of leaving," he said. "I've left towns, work, graves behind me. Not this time." She studied him, searching for hesitation, but found none. Slowly, She leaned closer until her head rested against his shoulder. His arm went around her without thought, and she stayed there, her breathing evening out for the first time since the knock at the door. The fire burned low. Rue felt her weight against him, warm and steady, and knew the dugout was no longer just a shelter. It was theirs. For the first time since he had staggered through the sand, the thought of tomorrow did not feel like something to dread. It felt like something worth defending. The thaw came slow, dripping from the rim in thin streams that cut into the sand. Rue and Ilara worked each morning to keep the dugout clear, hauling wood, checking the tunnel, sharing tasks as if they had lived together far longer than a handful of weeks. But both knew what any listener would ask. What happens when the riders return, when suspicion sharpens into proof, when exile is no longer enough to keep danger away? Would Rue finally walk away to save himself, or would Ilara send him off to keep her own life intact? The answers came sooner than either of them wanted. The sound of hooves carried into the canyon at midday. Not distant this time, but close, too close. Rue stepped to the crack in the door and counted 5 riders, not 3. Their voices carried sharper now, the tone not of men passing, but of men searching. Ilara's face tightened, but she didn't falter. She pulled the bar from the door and turned to him. "Stay behind the shelf. If they find you, there is no one." Rue's jaw clenched. "I'm not hiding while you stand alone." Her eyes burned into his. "If you show yourself, we both die. If you let me speak, maybe we live." He wanted to argue, but the truth of it was solid. So he slid back into the crawl space, knife in his boot, revolver close, every muscle strung tight. He watched through a narrow gap as Ilara opened the door. The men dismounted, pushing forward, voices harsh. They demanded to see inside, accused her of lying, of hiding someone. One pointed at the stacked wood pile, saying it looked too fresh, too carefully laid. Ilara met their eyes one by one, her voice steady. "This is my shelter. I build it. I keep no one here. You can look, but you will find nothing." They pushed past her, boots heavy on the dirt floor. Rue's heart hammered. One of them stopped near the sleeping shelf, the curtain just inches from his face. He reached out, tugging at the edge. Then another called him away, saying there was nothing here but scraps of beans and smoke. For a moment, it seemed they would leave, but the youngest lingered, his eyes fixed on Ilara. He asked why she had survived when others cast her out. His voice carried suspicion, but also something darker, a threat dressed as curiosity. Ilara's jaw set. She lifted her chin. "Because I'm stronger than you think." The man sneered, but the elder barked at him, and soon they turned back to their horses. Hooves faded again, sand crunching under iron until the canyon grew quiet. Rue slid from the crawl space, sweat cold on his back. He found Ilara leaning against the door, her shoulders shaking once before she steadied herself. He crossed to her, laying a hand on her arm. She looked up at him, eyes wet but fierce. "They will not stop," she said. "Not until they believe I am nothing." Rue shook his head. "You're not nothing, and you're not alone." The words hung in the dugout, heavier than any silence before. She reached for him, her hands clutching his shirt, and he held her tight, his chin against her hair. For a long while, neither spoke. When they finally pulled apart, the fire had burned low. Rue sat with her beside him, his hands still at her back. "We can't just wait for them to come again. We make this ours, a home, not a hiding place." Ilara studied him, eyes searching for weakness. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Then we stay together." That evening they cooked beans and rabbit, eating side by side. Rue marked a plan in the dirt. Where to plant when the thaw opened the creek bed. Where to cut a second shelf into the wall. Where to set a cradle board if the time came. Ilara watched him, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. "You speak like a man who belongs here." "I do," he answered without hesitation. "With you." Night fell, and for the first time they did not sleep apart. She lay against him, her hand on his chest, his arm around her waist. The storm outside had broken, the canyon breathing quiet. By dawn, the world looked different. The riders might come again. Danger might still circle the rim. But inside the dugout, the choice had been made. Rue was no longer a wanderer. Elara was no longer alone. Their shelter was not just stone and fire anymore. It was a home, a life built out of exile and survival, held together by the decision to stay. And that was the end of it. Clear, certain, finished. Two lives bound in the canyon, not by chance, but by the choice neither of them would ever turn from again. Or so they thought. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in a breathtaking tapestry of gold and rose, Rue stepped out of the dugout, a renewed sense of purpose coursing through him. He had his plan. They had their life. He was no longer running, but building. He felt the weight of the past finally begin to lift, a silent ghost finally put to rest. He stood on the edge of the canyon, looking out at the vast, open land stretching to the horizon. It was a promise, a canvas for their future, a place of peace, and a chance to finally heal from the wounds of the past. He felt a smile touch his lips, a genuine one for the first time in years. He thought of Elara, still asleep in the warmth of the dugout, and a wave of profound peace washed over him. Then he heard it. Not the familiar sound of hooves, but a low, guttural growl that came from the shadows of the rocks. His hand went to his empty holster, a phantom habit, and his breath hitched. He had been so focused on the riders, so consumed